My name is Doug. Well, that isn't my real name, but it's close enough. I've been listening to your channel for a while now, and every time you say, you can send your story in if you've had an encounter, I think to myself, yeah, I ought to do that. And then I shut my mouth and I go about my day like I never thought that at all. I'm 43 years old. I've been hunting since I was big enough to sit still in the woods without whining. I've walked the same ridges and hollers for decades, in all kinds of weather, at all hours of the day and night. I'm not a nervous fellow by nature. I don't scare easily. But I will tell you this, and I say it without any shame at all. I have not set foot in the woods before daylight since the morning something put its hand on the same tree I was sitting in. This happened 3 seasons ago during the first week of November. Anyone who hunts whitetails will tell you that's prime time. The rut's starting to crank up, bucks getting dumb, does on edge. It's my favorite time of year. My family owns about 80 acres in southern Ohio, most of it hills and hollows. You can't see the road from our place. You park beside the old barn and you're already a world away from any town. Out past the barn, the land rolls down into a long, narrow hollow that runs north to south with a little creek at the bottom and oak ridges on both sides. I've hunted that hollow since I was a teenager. I know where the deer like to cross, where they bed, where the wind swirls wildly in the morning and yet stays calm in the evenings. I've tripped over the same logs for 20 years. Cussed out the same briar patches, and watched the same tree snag for years before it finally fell in a storm. My dad always said, Doug, you stick with that hollow, and it'll fill your freezer if you treat it right. He was right. It's been my honey hole, especially during rut. Over the years, I had done my share of bow hunting, but 3 years ago I decided to get more serious about it. I invested in a new climbing stand and a new compound bow. I spent the whole summer shooting in the backyard, practicing with paper plates set up at 20, 30, 40, and many more yards beyond. I wanted to improve my draw speed and, of course, accuracy. I had taken many bucks over the years, but that year I had one particular buck in mind. I'd gotten trail cam pictures of him in early October. Big 8-point. Heavy beams, thick neck already starting to swell. He'd hit the same scrape 3 nights in a row on the lower side of that hollow, about halfway up the ridge. I knew if I played the wind right, got in there without bumping him, I had a real chance. I also knew I had to be in that tree well before first light. That's just one of the rules, and I've always lived by it. Deer don't tolerate much nonsense, and they will buck out of an area at the least little thing. But I was going in after that deer. At least, that's what I thought I was going in after. The day before my encounter, I went down into that hollow mid-afternoon to do what I call a last look. I didn't want to stomp around too much, but I eased down a side trail and checked where my stand tree would be. It's a tall, straight white oak, about 20 yards above the main game trail, just off the side of the hill. The creek gurgles below, and a little bench runs along the hillside about 25 yards out. That scrape I mentioned is right on the edge of that bench. Perfect bow range. I stood there and I looked everything over. Wind usually comes down the hollow in the morning, which would put it in my face. No new deadfalls blocking my climb. Some fresh buck rubs on saplings along the trail. Sap still wet. Everything looked dialed in. I backed out the way I came, slow and quiet. That night, I laid everything out like I always do. My bow was checked, arrows inspected, broadheads sharp enough I could shave with them. Climbing stand strapped and ready. Safety harness untangled and coiled nice and neat like a rope. Headlamp with the red light mode, plus a little backup flashlight in my pocket. My wife just shook her head at me when I set the coffee pot for 3:15 a.m. "You're insane," she said. "There's nothing out there worth getting up at 3 a.m. for." I laughed and I told her, "Oh, yes, there is. And you're going to change your mind when you're eating some good backstrap." If she'd known what I was really going to run into, she would never have let me walk out that door. When that alarm went off, it felt as if I had just closed my eyes. I rolled out of bed on autopilot. Coffee, toast, couple of fried eggs. It was one of those frosty cold mornings where the house feels extra warm, and the thought of going outside feels stupid, even though you love hunting. But still, habit is habit. I pulled on my base layers, camo, wool socks, boots, and grabbed all of my gear. The stars were out and shining bright against the clear black sky when I stepped onto the porch. They were looking like somebody spilled sugar across black velvet. I drove my old truck down by the barn and killed the lights. From there, I always walk in the dark. No sense lighting up the whole farm like a Christmas tree and letting every critter know exactly where I am and what I'm doing. The air had that hard, dry, cold smell, the kind that stings when you breathe in too fast. The air was dead still. No wind in the trees, no distant highway noise, just the faint ticking sounds of the barn as it cooled and settled. I clicked on my headlamp, red light only, and I started down the 2-track toward the hollow. The red beam paints everything really strange, flat and close. It's like you're looking at things underwater. My boots crunched on the hard frost, and every step sounded way too loud. That's a normal feeling going in before daylight. Your ears strain for every sound, and your brain makes monsters out of bushes. I've always been good at ignoring that. That morning, though, I noticed pretty quick that the woods were extra quiet. No owl calls, no distant coyote yips, not even that little background rustling that usually comes from squirrels and smaller critters moving around in the leaves. I noticed it, but I didn't think much of it right then. I just thought, well, cold morning, things will wake up later. I crossed the little pasture and slipped into the tree line at the top of the hollow, following a path I could have walked blindfolded. Down the slope, slow and careful, feeling with my feet more than looking with my eyes. Headlamp aimed down so I wouldn't spotlight the whole hillside. But about halfway down, I stopped. Something had popped a stick somewhere off to my right. Now, that alone isn't unusual. Deer break sticks. So do raccoons, foxes, whatever. But this one sounded heavy, not like a little twig snapping under something's paw. This was more like somebody stepped on a large, dry branch, and it gave all at once under heavy weight. I waited, listening. Nothing. Just my own breathing. I told myself it was probably just a deer that I'd bumped, and I kept going. I got down to the bottom of the hollow, and I followed the creek a short distance before angling back up toward my oak. Even in the dark, you know when you're getting close to your tree. The ground starts to feel a little more familiar under your boots. And that's when I heard it again. Crack. Same direction, up the hill to my right. Not far, 30, 40 yards at most. This time there was follow-up to it, though. The sound of leaves being pushed aside, then a pause, then another heavy step. That's the best way I can describe it. Heavy. Not a deer bounding away or the skittering of a smaller animal. These were slow and deliberate footsteps. I went still as a fence post. I eased my head just enough to tilt my ear that way, trying to sort out what I was hearing without moving my light. 2 more steps, leaves compressing with the weight. You learn to judge animals by sound when you've spent enough time in the woods. Squirrels sound like a herd of elephants half the time, but they're quick and jittery. Deer are more consistent, but they have a certain lightness in their step. even the big-bodied bucks. But whatever this was did not sound light. I told myself, again, maybe it's a big doe. Maybe it's that 8-point easing up the hillside. You know, the rut does weird things to deer. They'll move around at odd hours, cut across places they normally would never think to. But there was something about the timing of this that felt off. This would take a step, then stand still for a long beat, then take another step. There was no rustling of antlers and branches, no hooves slipping on rocks, just weight coming down on dry leaves every few yards. It felt like someone trying not to be noticed and doing a really bad job of it. I thought about switching my headlamp to white light and just blasting the hillside to see what it was. But that went against everything I knew about hunting. You do not spotlight the woods that you're about to sit in. You just don't do it. So I did what any stubborn hunter would do. I decided to ignore it and go on and get up in my tree. My oak tree was maybe 15 or 20 yards ahead, a little up the slope on the left side of the hollow. I eased over to it, doing my best not to think about whatever was walking in the leaves on the opposite side. As quietly as I could, I unstrapped my climber and chained the bottom section to the base of the tree. I kept waiting for another sound, some clue, but it had gone quiet again. I told myself, good, it moved on. It was probably nothing anyway. I slipped my boots into the stirrups of the stand and started climbing, easing the top section up, then bringing the bottom up under me in that slow inchworm rhythm. Thunk, slide, thunk, slide. I got up to about 20 feet, maybe a little more, and I locked the stand in where I wanted it. I took my time getting the safety harness wrapped around the trunk and clipped in. And that's one habit I'm glad I've always had. Once everything was snug, I hauled my bow up on the pull rope, settled into the seat, and finally allowed myself to just sit still. It was that deep, black time right before the first hint of dawn. You know it's getting close, but your eyes haven't picked up on it yet. The sky isn't gray, it's just, less black than it was. I listened to the creek murmuring down below. I could smell the damp earth, the faint tannic odor of wet leaves. And yet under all of that, there was something else. It was subtle at first, just a hint on the air, a smell like wet dog, but stronger and ranker. Almost like a barn that needed airing out after a long winter, a mix of sweat and some old hay, and there was still something else under it, something sour, something I could not name. I frowned and sniffed a couple of times, trying to place it. The smell would strengthen, then fade, like whatever was causing it was moving with the air currents down in the hollow. And that's when I heard the first grunt. It was low and muffled, somewhere up the hillside behind me and off to my right. My first thought, honestly, was buck. Not a smart thought, but that's where my brain went. During the rut, you hear bucks grunting and wheezing and carrying on all over the woods. They'll work scrapes, circle does, and stomp around all noisy like little freight trains. But the more I listened, the more wrong it sounded. A buck's grunt is short and sharp, almost like someone squeezing the air out of a rubber ball. This sound was deeper, wetter, and too controlled. It didn't have that chuff-chuff rhythm to it. It was more like somebody clearing their chest quietly. Then I heard another one. Then came a long pause. Then one more grunt. Each time it seemed to be a hair closer, and the smell got stronger too, that barnyard doggy sour smell. I can't say exactly when my brain made the flip from buck to something else, but it did, and it crept up on me. 1 second I'm thinking, He's circling downwind of the scrape. Get ready. And the next second, every hair on my body is standing up, and I'm suddenly very aware that I am 20 feet up in a tree in the dark with nothing but a bow and a harness strap. The woods around me were still dead quiet apart from that low sound and the occasional shift of leaves. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was like the whole hollow was holding its breath. My heart started beating hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. I adjusted my grip on the bow, more for comfort than anything else, and then I took a slow breath through my nose. And the smell hit me like a slap. It was strong now, very close. Whatever was making that smell and that sound was very near. And it was too big, too heavy, and too wrong to be that deer. The first actual movement that I heard from it that I could nail down as right there was the sound of leaves shuffling almost directly behind my tree, maybe just a little off to the side. Very slow. One step, pause. Another step, pause. It was in no hurry or crashing around like a spooked deer or a bear making a fuss. It sounded like something that knew exactly where it was putting its feet. My back was up against the tree trunk. That's how I set it up. I like having the tree to my back, facing the hollow, bow in hand, ready for deer to work that bench in the scrape. Unfortunately, that meant that whatever was coming up behind the tree was out of my line of sight, unless I turned. I did not want to turn. I can't explain that part rationally. I've had coyotes come in behind me. I've had other hunters walk right under my tree. And it never bothered me to ease my head over and take a look. This time, though, something in me revolted against the idea of moving at all. You hear people in your stories say that they felt like they were prey all of a sudden, that they were being hunted. I always thought that sounded like some crazy drama until that morning that I'm telling you about. And that's exactly what it felt like to me. I was very aware of how fast I could, or couldn't, get out of that tree. Aware of how much open ground there was between my oak and the nearest thicker cover. And I was hyper-aware of how alone I was. My breathing went shallow. The smell was all around me now, heavy and thick. The footsteps got right up behind the tree. I could hear the faint scuff of something brushing the bark. And then the whole tree shuddered under me. It was subtle, not like somebody hit it with a truck or anything, but it was enough to make the stand creak a little, and my safety harness strap tightened across my chest. Something had put weight up against the tree. My first instinct was this was a bear. That's the only thing in my experience that's big enough and dumb enough to try climbing my tree with me in it. We don't have a big black bear population right there, but there are enough around that the Ohio Department of Natural Resources will warn you from time to time about them. I had just formed the thought of, oh God, it's a bear, when I heard something that did not fit bear at all. There was a soft, almost fleshy slap against the bark. Not like claws digging in, and not scraping, just some kind of hard contact. Then a slow, sliding sound, like a palm being dragged lightly down the trunk. And then, very distinctly, the faint creak of bark under pressure in one spot, as if fingers were pressing in and testing it and pulling at it. You know how you can tell in a tree stand when somebody puts a hand on the trunk and leans? The vibration will find its way up the wood and into the soles of your boots. That's what this was like. Whatever had hold of the tree at the bottom was strong enough and heavy enough that I could feel it 20 feet up. I swallowed hard and realized my mouth was dry. The urge to look broke through the fear. I had to see what this was. Slow as I could, I turned my head to the left and downward. I was trying not to make the stand squeak, just enough of movement to get a sliver of view around the trunk. At that moment, the sky had shifted from black to the very first hint of gray. It wasn't daylight, but it wasn't the deep darkness either anymore. Now shapes had edges to them. You could tell where the ridgeline was, where the hollow opened up. And down there, at the base of my tree, I saw a shape that changed what I believed about the woods forever. At first my brain tried very hard not to understand it. I could see part of a shoulder and an upper arm, big as a fence post, pressed against the trunk on the back side of the tree. The hair on it looked dark and rough, matted in some places, shorter on the shoulder, thicker down the arm. From my angle, I could just see where that arm bent, and beyond that a huge hand splayed against the bark. The fingers were long and thick, almost as long as my whole palm, with hair running down nearly to the knuckles, but not over the inside of the hand. The skin there looked darker than mine, but lighter than the hair. It was kind of a weathered, leathery gray-brown. The thumb was set lower and farther down than a human's would be, but you could tell it was a thumb. This was not some paw. There were nails, blunt and thick-looking, but they weren't claws like a bear would have. That hand flexed, the fingers tightening into the bark, and I heard the wood creak a little. Whatever it belonged to let out a low, breathy sound, like a big man sighing through his nose. I froze so hard I might as well have been carved into that tree. Slowly, that arm relaxed a little, and then that shape shifted. I saw a massive shoulder roll as it straightened up. Then it moved away from my view. I had a few panicked moments looking for it, scanning through the darkness. I was no longer frozen. Then I saw it again, off to my left, about 30 feet away and down the slope a little. I saw its head and upper body come into view beside a great tree. I want to be clear about the distance. I've played this over in my mind 1,000 times, pacing it off after the fact. From the base of my tree to where the bow range marker is on that bench, it's about 25 yards. This thing was closer than that. Half the distance, maybe less. It stood there, partly turned away at first, giving me a 3/4 view from behind. I could see the back of its head, the neck, or what passed for a neck, and the slope of the shoulders. The head was kind of domed on top, not pointy like some people say, but the back of the skull ran down into the shoulders with no neck showing. The hair on the head looked a little shorter than the rest of the body, and it lay much flatter. It shifted its stance and turned its head slightly to sniff the air. That's when I saw its face. I will never forget that face. The brow ridge stood out, heavy and pronounced, shading deep-set eyes. The nose was wide and fairly flat to the face, with big nostrils that flared a little when it breathed. Its mouth was wider than a human's, though not by much, and it had lips that looked dark and heavily chapped. There was hair on the cheeks and the jaw, but it was thinner around the mouth and the nose, so I could see the skin underneath. The eyes, they were dark. In that low light I couldn't pick out a color, but they weren't glowing or anything like that. They looked like very dark, very focused eyes set under thick brows. But what got me, more than anything, was the expression. It didn't look crazed or monstrous or angry. It looked irritated, curious, maybe, and quite a bit irritable, like it had found something where it wasn't supposed to be, and it wasn't sure what to do about it. It was breathing hard enough that I could see its chest rise and fall under the hair. The chest and shoulders were massive, like someone took a great heavyweight power lifter and just added another 50% of bulk on top of that. It was barrel-chested, thick through the upper body, tapering down somewhat to the waist. It stood there, body angled downhill, one hand still on the tree, and the other arm hanging down near its knee. Its legs were proportionate to its size, not stumpy at all. I couldn't see the feet, though, from my angle. It was not hunched over like some gorilla. No, it was standing perfectly upright. Some small part of my brain whispered, "That's a man in a suit." Probably because that was the only box my brain had to put it in. But the rest of me knew that was nonsense. The way the muscles shifted under the hair, the way it moved, the way the chest rose and fell with the breathing, and the sheer scale of it. Well, no man I've ever known can fill out a space quite like that. That smell was like a physical thing now. It rolled up the tree into my nose and coated the back of my throat. I almost had tears in my eyes from holding my breath, trying not to smell it. As I watched, it turned its head and looked straight up at me. Our eyes met for a few moments. There are some things I really can't explain or put into words. That moment, that eye contact, is one of them. There was intelligence there. There was not some animal curiosity or some simple fight or flight. It looked at me like it was measuring me, weighing up what I was. Did it need to do anything about me? I don't know how long we held that eye contact. It might have been 3 seconds. It might have been 30. I'm not sure. Time went sideways when we locked eyes. I do know my hands were shaking, and I had enough presence of mind to be grateful that I wasn't holding a firearm. Because if I'd had a rifle in my hands, I might have done something stupid out of sheer terror. And I have no doubt in my mind that if I had shot that thing and not dropped it clean, it would have come up that tree, and it would have peeled me out like a peanut from a shell. Instead, all I could do was stare back, my heart hammering, trying not to pass out. Then it did something that surprised me. It gave this low, almost disgusted-sounding huff, like a person blowing air out through their nose when they're annoyed, and it took a step away from the tree, then another. It turned its whole body, not just the head, and it started walking down the slope, angling toward the lower part of the hollow. If it had screamed at me or shaken the tree or thrown something, maybe I'd have some different kind of trauma. But what really messed with me that morning was how calm it was. It didn't stomp around. It wasn't beating its chest or roaring at me. It just walked away like it decided I wasn't worth whatever energy it might have to expend to do something about me. Its stride was long and smooth, almost kind of gliding. Each step covered more ground than a normal person's would by a good length. The arm swung slightly at its side, hands relaxed. I watched the muscles in its back and shoulders bunch and release under the hair as it moved. There was nothing awkward about its movement. This was not something out of place in those woods. I tell you, this was something of those woods. In a handful of seconds, it had gone from being almost under my tree to standing down on that little bench near the scrape that I'd been so fixated on. It paused there, side on now, and I got another look at its height relative to the saplings around it. There's a particular little maple tree down there that I've always used as a yardage marker. I know exactly how high it is because my nephew measured it once to settle an argument about how tall he was getting. That creature's shoulder was level with the branches on that maple that I later measured at just over 7 feet off the ground. Its head rose well above that. I will easily put its height at 8 feet, maybe 8.5 feet tall. I know that might sound crazy, But I also know how big that tree is. It stood there, facing downslope for a few seconds. Then it turned its head back to my tree one more time, like it was making sure I was going to stay put and not give it any trouble. We locked eyes again. I didn't move. After a few seconds, it stepped off the bench and dropped out of my line of sight, vanishing into the thicker stuff below. For a few seconds, I could hear it moving. Those same slow, deliberate steps, a faint brushing sound as it pushed through the laurel and the saplings. Then it was just gone. But the smell lingered a little longer. Then it, too, finally faded. The woods stayed quiet. Not even a bird called for what felt like forever. I don't know how long I sat there after it left. At some point I realized the sky had gone from gray to that soft early morning blue. Daylight was coming in full. I should have been listening for deer, watching that scrape and doing what I came to do. Instead, I was locked into some kind of fog. My hands were numb, but not from the cold, just from holding my bow in a death grip. Eventually, the survival part of my brain piped up and said, "You cannot stay in this tree all day. You have to get down." That thought was almost as bad as being up there with it below me, because now I had to go back down that trunk, back to the exact spot where it had stood. I waited until I heard a few normal sounds, the distant call of some crows, a squirrel somewhere down the hollow fussing about something. Then, as quietly as I could, I unhooked my bow from the hanger and tied it back on the pool rope. My fingers fumbled the knot twice. I had to talk to myself out loud, whispering, "Slow down, breathe. You've done this 100 times." Once the bow was lowered, I clipped the tether higher on the tree, loosened the stand, and started inchworming my way down. That was the longest climb of my life. Every faint squeak of metal sounded like a gunshot. Every little flake of bark that fell might as well have been a signal flare. I kept expecting to hear that heavy breathing again, hear that low grunt, and see it step back into view. But nothing happened. I got down to about 6 feet off the ground, braced myself, and stepped off the stand into the leaves. My legs felt like they were made of rubber. For a second I just stood there, one hand on the tree, bow on the ground next to me on its rope, turning slowly in a circle, and I was looking at every shadow. The smell was faint, but it was still there. It wasn't fresh like before, but it was lingering, the way smoke hangs around long after a fire is out. I pulled the climber off the tree as fast as I dared without clanging it against the trunk, and I slid it onto my back. Then I grabbed my bow, and I just started walking. I didn't, though, go straight back the way I came. Some half-baked instinct in me told me not to walk right where it had gone, which is exactly how I came in. So I angled along the hillside instead, staying a little higher. I kept my eyes scanning the trees, and my ears tuned for any sound that wasn't mine. My heart didn't start to slow down until I was out of the hollow and back near the barn, where the fields and the sky opened up again. Now later that day, because I am apparently not smart enough to leave well enough alone, I went back there. But I didn't go alone. I brought my brother with me. Now, he's 2 years younger than me, and he's hunted just as long. I didn't tell him everything right away. I just said, "I had something really weird happen this morning. Come take a look at this with me." So we walked down mid-afternoon, sunlight high, birds chirping, and nothing creepy at all about the day at that point. It felt like a different planet from earlier that morning. At the base of my tree, the first thing I pointed out was the bark. There were 4 long, shallow grooves running down the trunk about waist high. Not claw marks, no, these were more like compressed trails where rough skin or nails had pressed and slid. You could see where bits of outer bark had flaked off. Beside that, there was a spot where the bark looked almost polished for maybe 6 or 8 inches, like something with a broad, flat surface had been rubbed or pressed against it. "Looks like something rubbed up on it," my brother said. "Deer, maybe?" "Nah, deer don't stand up and palm a tree like that," I said. My voice sounded tight even to my own ears. "No, they don't do it like that." My brother frowned and put his own hand up there, fingers spread. His hand barely covered half the width of that smooth patch. "That's weird," he said. "Bear, maybe?" "And we don't have grizzlies or anything like that here, and black bear claws tend to leave very distinct marks when they climb. No, these were different." I didn't argue right then with him. I just nodded like, well, maybe that's a possibility. Maybe that's what it was. Then I led him down to the bench where the scrape was. It was torn up more than it had been the day before, but not in a deer kind of way. The ground was scuffed wider than a normal scrape, and some of the overhanging branches were broken higher up than a buck would normally reach with his antlers. A little farther down the slope, where the ground levels out before it drops to the creek, there was a damp patch where water had seeped up. The soil there was soft and dark. In that patch, there was a depression. It wasn't a perfect footprint, but it was there, and it was big, longer than my boot, and wider, too. Maybe 15, 16 inches long, from the edge of one end to the other, I mean. You could see where the weight had sunk it deeper at the heel, and the front was more spread, like the toes had been there clearly, but the details were smushed as it moved along. I stood there looking at it with my brother, neither of us saying anything for a minute. Finally he said, "Well, that could be where somebody else slipped in the mud, maybe." I looked at him and I said, "Somebody with a canoe paddle for a foot?" I couldn't stop myself. It just popped out. He shot me a look and shrugged. "Hey, I don't know, man. You asked me to come take a look, so I'm taking a look. I'm looking." I realized I was edging towards telling him the whole thing, but I clamped my mouth shut. I was not ready to hear my own brother tell me I was crazy. We walked back out with him talking about bucks and rut patterns and me nodding the whole time, but not hearing half of it. Now that season, I did not kill that 8-point. I really didn't kill anything out of that hollow. I did try once to go back in there before daylight, about a week later. I got as far as the top of the hollow. I stopped under those trees, turned my headlamp on, and my body just stopped. My feet refused to go any further. I stood there for probably 2 full minutes, arguing with myself. "Come on, Doug. You've hunted this place forever. There's nothing out here that's going to hurt you if you just keep your head on straight." But then another voice in my head, quieter and more convincing, said, "Oh, that's not true. You already know it isn't true anymore. There is something out there, and you don't know what it might or might not do to you." In the end, I backed out. I sat at the edge of the field that morning and watched the sunrise from a hedgerow like I was 10 years old again. My hand shook so bad when I poured my coffee, I spilled half of it. Since then, yes, I have hunted, but only from the ground or from stands that I can walk to in full daylight. I'll sit into dark on some evenings, but you won't catch me walking into the woods in pitch black any more. My wife sure noticed the change. She asked me why I suddenly wasn't going into the hollow that I used to swear by. I told her I'd burned that hollow out, and I was going to give it a rest. Well, I guess that much was true. I didn't tell her the full story until last year after she caught me listening to your channel and she asked what I was so interested in. Normally I shut it off before she came into the room, but I didn't hear her come in. So I paused the video and I asked her, "You remember that season that I just stopped hunting the hollow?" "Yeah," she said. "I figured you were just getting old and lazy." And she playfully slapped my shoulder. I looked at her and shook my head, and I told her everything. I expected her to laugh. My wife's a practical woman, and she doesn't spook easy either, and she doesn't believe in superstition or things that might be considered paranormal or otherworldly or whatever you want to call Bigfoot. She didn't laugh, though. She did listen, her face getting more and more serious. And when I finished, she said, "Well, that explains the way you've been acting." I asked her, "So you believe me?" She said, "I believe you saw what you're telling me, and I know you're not the type to make up a story like that. I don't know what you saw, but I know it was enough to put some fear into you, and you've never backed down from the woods before." Just her saying that meant the world to me. I told her how it had been weighing so heavily on me, how I needed to tell it to someone, to be believed, to be told I'm not crazy. I had thought of telling my brother, sure, but for a lot of reasons I didn't. So I stayed quiet. But now I didn't have to hide things in my own house. If I wanted to order all kinds of books about Bigfoot from Amazon, I did. And if I wanted to listen to Bigfoot stories on YouTube all night, I could. And I didn't have to shut it off as soon as I thought she was going to come into the room. I didn't have to hide anything anymore. After a few weeks, my wife told me, "You know, if you tell anybody else about this, they're going to call you crazy. So maybe you can tell those weird story people on YouTube instead. They'll believe you. Maybe that will make you feel better." Well, here I am, taking my wife's advice. I'm not saying you're a weird story person, Nance, but I think you get my meaning. Now, before this happened, if you had asked me about Bigfoot, I would have told you, "Nah, that's all made up. Ain't no such thing. Or if there is such a thing, it sure ain't here in Ohio." Now, it's no surprise to you that I think and believe differently. I will say this with as much certainty on anything I've ever known in my life as to what I saw. It was not a bear or someone in a suit. I believe with all my existence it was the Ohio Bigfoot. Now, most of all, I know how it made me feel. I felt very, very small, very weak, and very aware that I was in its living room, not the other way around. I cannot offer any rational explanation for the actions that it had that morning, but it is my belief it was letting me know it knew I was there, and it didn't want me coming down out of that tree, at least not right then. Maybe it was hunting that 8.2. I've heard you say on your channel that once you've seen one of these things, you never go back to who you were before, that you just can't. That is true. I still love the woods. I still love the rut. I still love hearing a buck grunt and rattle out in the distance. But there's a second layer now, always a second layer out there. A part of me that's listening for heavier steps, constantly sniffing the air for any hint of that sour, doggy stink on the wind. I'm always watching the tree trunks behind whatever deer I'm glassing. When daylight starts fading, I call it a day. I don't want to be there after dark, though I have a few times just to push myself. Truth is, the only thing I've really changed is I try not to hunt alone. I think that's smart for everyone. Strange things happen in the woods to people that are by themselves. I never knew that until I started reading and watching material on this subject and other subjects related to it. Well, now you have my story. You can share this on your channel. Maybe it will help someone realize they need to trust their gut a little more while they're out there, because they absolutely do. And you can tell them that advice came from a hunter who thought he knew his woods. Then he found out he didn't. Signed, Doug. I think a lot of hunters find out some things they didn't know were out there in those woods, and it's always a bit of a surprise. But should it be? Well, you can be the judge on that. All right, folks. Well, I am sorry I had to postpone the live stream from this past Sunday to next Sunday. I was really, really sick. My voice is just now kind of recovering. At this rate, I am planning for this coming Sunday. What date would that be? Let me look. That would be the 7th of December. So be tuned for that. The 7th of December is a Sunday. I'm going to plan it for about 6 o'clock. Now, the following weekend, December 13th, a Saturday, we're going to kick off the 12 days of Squatchmas. I know everyone looks forward to that every year. I'm still a few stories short for that. So if you have one, please send it in. Otherwise, folks, I think I'm going to call it a wrap for tonight. And I wish you all a lovely, lovely evening wherever you are, or daytime. And until we meet up again, please always remember, absence of proof is not proof of absence. Thanks for listening.